There are big problems with the plan for Operation Blau. Logistics and supplies were already strained to breaking point. The distances to be covered were vast, and the Germans did not have the resources to capture it.
In the winter of 1943, it looked like Nazi Germany was finished on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad had fallen. The Red Army was unstoppable. But then, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein did the impossible. He defied Hitler's orders, staged a daring gamble, and turned a catastrophic defeat into one of the most shocking reversals in military history. How did one German general turn a crushing defeat into one of the most shocking victories of World War II? Let's find out. As 1943 began, the situation for Germany in the East was nothing short of catastrophic. The Sixth Army had just been wiped out at Stalingrad, where over 300,000 Axis soldiers were trapped, starved, and crushed. The dream of seizing Soviet oil fields and breaking the Red Army's back had crumbled into dust. Instead of victory, the Germans faced disaster. Their armies weren't advancing anymore. They were being encircled, beaten, and destroyed. Across the Don River, the Soviet offensives ripped through Germany's weakened allies. Hungarian, Italian, and Romanian units collapsed under the Red Army's hammer blows, unable to hold the line against the overwhelming Soviet pressure. The defensive barriers along the Don and Donets River, once vital strongpoints, were shattered. Huge gaps tore open across the front, and the Germans were forced into chaotic retreats. The Soviet momentum was frightening. Operation Star and Operation Gallop, launched by commanders like Vautoudin and Golikov, hammered the retreating Wehrmacht, driving it back more than 175 miles. Kursk fell. Belgorod fell, and finally, on February 16th, Kharkov, the prized city of the south, slipped from German hands. Army Group South, once feared and admired, was falling apart. Rostov-on-Don, the gateway to the Caucasus, was now vulnerable. German units were disintegrating into exhausted, broken fragments. Supplies were running low. Morale was plummeting. In Berlin, Hitler refused to accept the scale of the disaster, issuing desperate orders to hold every inch of ground no matter the cost. But it didn't matter. The ground itself was slipping away. Yet amid the collapse, one man refused to panic. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, placed in command of Army Group South at the darkest hour, didn't see only disaster, he saw a chance. While Hitler obsessed over lost territory, Manstein looked at the enemy. The Red Army's advance had been ferocious, but it had also been reckless. The Soviet spearheads had raced far ahead of their support, stretching their lines thin, exposing their flanks, and overloading their supply routes. Their tanks were running low on fuel. Their infantry was exhausted. Their victories had blinded them to the danger they were marching straight into. Manstein realized the truth. The Red Army was vulnerable. If someone struck fast enough, hard enough, and with the right plan. But there was a massive obstacle standing in his way: Hitler himself. The Führer was fixated on static defense, ordering his armies to hold every position no matter how hopeless. Retreat was seen not as a tactical choice, but as betrayal. Manstein knew that kind of thinking would doom them all. If he was going to save Army Group South, he needed one thing above all: the freedom to move, to maneuver, to fight the way he knew best. So in late February 1943, with Soviet tanks barely 30 kilometers from his headquarters at Zaporozhye, Manstein took a bold gamble. He flew directly to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to confront him face to face. It was a dangerous move. Others who had dared challenge Hitler's orders had been dismissed or sidelined. But Manstein wasn't just any general. Calm, precise, and carrying the weight of Germany's survival on his shoulders, he made his case. Without freedom of action, the entire southern front would collapse. He didn't plead. He laid down the cold, brutal facts. And almost miraculously, Hitler agreed. Reluctantly, but decisively, he gave Manstein partial operational freedom, one of the very few times he would allow such independence during the entire war. The chains were off. Manstein was free to strike back. He already knew exactly how to do it. The Soviet advance had been ferocious, but reckless. Their spearheads were dangerously overextended, running thin on supplies, their flanks overexposed for hundreds of kilometers. Manstein's plan was brutally simple: lure them forward even further, then hit their sides with everything he had, trap them, and destroy them. But he would need the right hammer to swing. That hammer would be the SS Panzer Corps. Freshly transferred from France, the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions were some of the toughest units the Germans had left. Hardened by years of brutal combat, fanatically loyal and heavily equipped, they were the best Germany could muster for a desperate blow. Their tanks were some of the finest machines on the battlefield. The Panzer IV, now fitted with a long 75mm gun, could finally go toe-to-toe with the Soviet T-34s. And then there were the Tigers, massive beasts mounting 88mm guns that could tear through Soviet armor at staggering distances. Mobility was another key advantage. Unlike the foot-slogging Soviet infantry, the German Panzer Grenadiers rolled into battle aboard half-tracks, giving them speed and flexibility the Red Army couldn't match. And now, after months of struggle, the skies were turning in Germany's favor too. The Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet, battered but not broken, had rebuilt its strength. From barely 300 sorties a day during the Stalingrad disaster, the German Air Force was now flying over 1,000 missions daily. Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers swooped low to hammer Soviet columns. FW-190 fighter bombers raked Red Army supply lines. For the first time in months, the Germans could strike from the air with overwhelming power. On February 19th, the counterattack erupted. The SS Panzer Corps surged forward, launching a blistering southward assault. They moved like a blade through the snow, cutting into Soviet flanks with devastating precision. At the same time, 4th Panzer Army and 1st Panzer Army hammered into the exposed Soviet formations, creating chaos across the front. Frozen rivers, shattered villages, and fields littered with wrecked tanks became the grim backdrop for Manstein's carefully orchestrated strike. One by one, Soviet spearheads began to unravel. Popov's mobile group, one of the Red Army's key armored formations meant to dive deep into the German rear, was crushed by February 24th. Entire Soviet tank corps were surrounded and obliterated. The very formations that had just weeks earlier stormed across the steppe, chasing a vision of total victory, were now being trapped and wiped out. Soviet commanders, who had dreamed of capturing Rostov and cutting off Army Group South entirely, suddenly found themselves scrambling for survival. Supply lines collapsed. Communication broke down. Red Army units that had once charged ahead with unstoppable momentum were now isolated, exhausted, and facing annihilation. And Manstein wasn't finished. As February bled into March, he tightened the pressure even more. Entire Soviet armies were now at risk of total collapse. On February 25th, Marshal Rokossovsky, desperate to salvage the situation, launched a fresh offensive from the Central Front. His goal was simple: punch a hole into the German lines north of Kharkov and relieve the crumbling Soviet positions. At first, it looked promising. Soviet forces pushed hard, making small gains, but the Germans had learned. The panzer divisions dug in and absorbed the blows, then counterattacked with brutal precision. Rokossovsky's offensive ground to a halt almost as soon as it started. Meanwhile, to the south of Kharkov, Manstein's real hammer blow fell. The 4th Panzer Army, supported by relentless Luftwaffe airstrikes, smashed into the Soviet flanks. Soviet supply lines, already strained by the endless winter mud and German air raids, collapsed entirely. The Soviet rear turned into a nightmare of struck convoys, abandoned tanks, and desperate retreating soldiers. By the beginning of March, Soviet units weren't just retreating, They were running. Whole sections of the front disintegrated. Kharkov, Belgorod, Kursk, all of them lay exposed, barely defended. The Red Army's stunning winter victories had given way to a disaster no one could deny. The Germans were now on the attack. The Red Army, which had seemed invincible just weeks earlier, scrambled to plug holes and hold the line. Soviet commanders, some of the best minds of the Red Army, realized too late that they had overreached. Their forces were scattered across too wide a front. Their tanks were running out of fuel. Their men were exhausted and half-starved. Manstein's gamble had worked. The front had not just been stabilized, it had been completely flipped. But for Manstein, the campaign wasn't over yet. He had a bigger prize in mind. Kharkov, the fallen city, the bitter symbol of German defeat. Retaking it would send a message to everyone, both the Allies and their own battered soldiers, that the Wehrmacht was still a force to be reckoned with. It would restore battered morale. It would erase, even if only briefly, the shadow of Stalingrad. Manstein planned it carefully. He didn't want a reckless, bloody assault on a fortified city. His strategy was clear: encircle Kharkov, squeeze it, force the Soviets to abandon it rather than fight to the death, save German lives, save his army's strength for the battles that were still to come. But not everyone shared Manstein's patience. General Paul Hauser, leading the SS Panzer Corps, was restless. The prize was within sight. The enemy was weakened, and Hauser was determined that it would be his men, the elite divisions of the SS, that would plant the flag over Kharkov. On March 10th, without waiting for the full encirclement to be completed, Hauser ordered a direct assault. On March 11th, the battle for Kharkov exploded, and it would become one of the bloodiest urban battles of the entire Eastern Front. The fighting was unlike anything the German soldiers had ever faced before. This wasn't sweeping tank attacks across open plains. This was brutal, close-quarter slaughter, fought house by house, street by street. Young Leibstandarte soldiers, many barely out of their teens, stormed shattered apartment buildings under a constant hail of Soviet sniper fire. Every floor was a trap. Every stairwell was a killing ground. Cellars became bunkers. Rooftops turned into sniper nests. Soviet machine guns covered every intersection. Anti-tank rifles and hidden T-34s ambushed German armor at point-blank range from behind collapsed buildings. Tanks couldn't maneuver. Streets were choked with rubble. In many places, the fighting degenerated into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets, pistols, even entrenching tools used in desperate, savage battles for stairwells and courtyards. Above them, the Luftwaffe did what it could. Stuka dive bombers roared over the city, dropping bombs with pinpoint accuracy onto Soviet strongpoints. But even the constant bombardment couldn't fully break the defenders' resolve. Kharkov's defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with desperate fury, turning every city block into a fortress. The SS Panzer divisions pressed forward with a grim determination. Leibstandarte attacked from the north, Das Reich from the west. Totenkopf shielded the flanks, fending off Soviet reinforcements trying to break through. By March 12th, the German forces had fought their way into the center of the city. Dzerzhinsky Square, once a bustling heart of Kharkov, was now a smoking ruin filled with burned-out trams and shattered buildings. Control of the square seesawed back and forth, each side fighting tooth and nail for every ruined corner. Finally, after days of relentless bloodshed, after countless small battles fought across kitchens, schoolrooms, and factory floors, the city's resistance began to collapse. By March 15th, the last pockets of Soviet defenders were overrun. Kharkov fell. When the German flag was raised over the ruins of Kharkov, it marked more than just the recapture of a city. It marked a stunning, if temporary, reversal of fortune for the battered Wehrmacht. Kharkov was back in German hands. Belgorod fell shortly after. The Soviet winter offensive, the great drive that had seemed poised to smash Army Group South once and for all, was shattered. Manstein's brilliant counterstroke had given the German army a second chance. For the first time since Stalingrad, there was hope. A battered, desperate hope, but hope nonetheless. Yet the cost was staggering. Thousands of lives lost, whole divisions gutted. The SS Panzer Corps alone suffered over 4,300 casualties during the fighting. Streets of Kharkov were littered with the dead. Blackened shells of buildings stood as silent witnesses to the carnage. And deep inside the Red Army's command, lessons were being learned. Painful, costly lessons. The Soviet commanders knew they had underestimated the enemy. They had overreached. They wouldn't make the same mistake again. For now, though, in that blood-soaked spring of 1943, Manstein had achieved what few thought possible. Against overwhelming odds, he had snatched a fleeting, brutal victory. He had turned disaster into triumph, if only for a while. The Eastern Front would ignite again soon enough, but at Kharkov, for a brief and terrible moment, the Germans had struck back and won. So, in the end, Manstein's counterattack was more than just a battlefield victory. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, a single bold move can change everything. If you're interested in more fascinating history content, make sure to click on the next video.